So, last night we discussed what is politeia, what is a regime, and we made clear that a regime is essentially taking the various sectors of society, the major sectors of society, and here we said, business, education, entertainment, military, politics, religion. And if you look at the souls of those leaders, you can start to see where that regime stands with respect to justice and the common good. And I think part of that also is that the souls of the leaders, by the force of being leaders, they determine the unwritten laws, the culture, customs, which in turn shapes the written laws, which these people will then write down the written laws, and then they will also give us the educational system. And in the course of the questions last night, I think one of the interesting features of any society is this concept of deviancy. And there was a social scientist, Carol Hendershot. She wrote a wonderful book called Deviancy, which I think is a book that offers us some great insight. And this is in response, I think, to that last question that was raised last night. Deviancy is a constant. What do we mean by that? We mean that, there's always going to be let's say 5% deviancy. But the question ultimately of a society is, what do you put in that 5%? What are the values, or what are the vices or virtues, or what are the qualities that the society characterizes as being deviant? And so a lot of the debates among elites of a society especially are about, they don't always self-recognize this, but they're essentially about what values do we consider deviant and what values do we consider normal. But Carol Hendershot, her book is interesting because she shows that deviancy is actually a constant. Right? It's actually a constant. And then something else I want to say about religion is that if you go back to the first societies, right? In the first societies, what we call now the pagan societies, they were essentially, some of the first cities are called the sacred city of Babylon, right? There was, I suppose you could say, before Christianity, there were two possibilities in the world, right? Something could be divine or it could be human. And it wasn't always clear how the divine and the human interconnected. So oftentimes in these pre-Christian societies, there were gods, right? The gods represent the divine, and there would be a place that would have some sort of object, and that's somehow where the divine met the human. But the divine, other than that, was unconcerned with human affairs, and so human affairs were just left to chance for the most part. So there were many. In a way, this I was talking about this morning with Professor Hernando, and Japan is still very much like these ancient societies, that men could live pretty much whatever kind of life they wanted to live, so long as they had a certain piety towards the gods or towards the shrines of a certain kind. And so that's always been an aspect of society. And I think once we get to Christianity, we see that there's a much different emphasis that's given to this. And I think also as society becomes more secular, it tends to revert more to the more pagan notion of the relationship between the human and the divine. So, are there any questions on what we've done so far? Yes.
What would you say, in terms of leaders of societies, what would you say about the role of someone like the prophet figure? Someone who kind of comes out, obviously in Israel it's clearest.
Yeah.
Someone who doesn't really belong to any one of the leadership positions, but just comes out and by the force of their moral example,
Right.
is actually able to redirect
Right.
society, or at least move a lot of people
Right.
in a different direction.
Right.
And I mean, Socrates is sort of a figure like this.
Yeah.
I think, even though he's
Yeah.
not in Israel, and obviously
Right.
the saints in the church, even in all, to kind of somehow seem to serve as they are leaders, but more just by dint of who they are.
Right.
And how does that fit in?
Yeah, so I think that would be the question is just like the prophetic figure. How does the prophetic figure fit in among the leaders? I would say, in a way, you could say they usually emerge from one of these factions, or they usually emerge from one of these areas, and they would be. You would look at the leader as. So I would look at them as, so you can look at the example of, in the Republic, you can take the example of Socrates and you can say there's a real contest that's going on from the time of Socrates until the time of Aristotle over the leadership of education in the Greek world. And you can also say in ancient Israel, there is a real contest going on between, let's say, Elijah, take the example of Elijah and Ahab over the religious and the political direction of Israel. Right? So I would say that someone like a prophet is, if you were to look at their soul, they would be obviously someone that knows or has an insight into divine things. Because a prophet there's two aspects to being a prophet. One is just knowing somehow divine things, and the other is being able to foretell the future in some way. So I would just say normally a prophet is going to emerge in one of these sectors, and he'll, within that sector and maybe within the society as a whole, he'll initiate, or his enemies will initiate, a kind of contest over the direction of that institution and of the society as a whole. The file is done.
Oh, great.
That was that noise.
Great.
When the file completes.
What a climax. Yeah.
So.
Fair.
Yes.
What did you mean by deviance is in every culture?
Every culture, deviancy, who are the criminals? Who are the people that are not accepted in polite company? That is a constant in every culture. There's like 5, I think Hendershot says it's like 5 or 6% of the values are considered deviant. The problem is that what cultures argue over, what societies argue over, is what goes into that 5%. What do you put in that bucket? But deviancy is a constant. You can never get rid of deviancy. There's never going to be a society where there's no deviancy. The question is, what is deviant and how do you deal with it?
I don't understand the significance of it. Is that an important point, or is that just
Yeah, it's extremely important. Because in a poorly run society, the good is in what's the good values are in the category of the deviant. In a well-ordered society, according to the common good, what is truly deviant is in the deviant.
I just don't understand the significance of it.
Sodomy is no longer deviant. So something else has to replace it in the category of deviancy in society.
Okay.
You can't just have a notion of the good. You always have to have some notion of evil for what's to be avoided to go along
That's
with it.
interesting. Okay.
So deviancy over time and over cultures is a constant.
It's like a balance, something has to fill the vacuum.
But there is, but what leaders, you could say, so if an oligarchy takes over, excessive money making and certain kinds of fraud or usury will not be considered deviant. It'll be part of the ordinary way of doing business. Right? Because why? The souls of the oligarchs make money making a priority.
Okay. Maybe being economical would be deviant in that culture.
Who knows? So, once we have this established, this reality of politeia, I think actually, this also brings us to Socrates in a way, like as John just mentioned, that the next problem that we face, and I think the Greek world gives us this combat, or this contest that took place between Socrates and then Plato and then Aristotle on the one hand and the sophist on the other hand. This contest helps us to understand like what's at stake, especially in the leadership of the educational field, but also in the political field. So, and this contest, of course, is laid out in the Republic. It's laid out in Book 1 of the Republic. But we can also say, just a brief history, right? You could say there's something that's kind of unique about the Greek world as far as other ancient cultures. Because by the time you get to Anaxagoras, we all know from our intro to ancient philosophy courses, right? You get the rise of the pre-Socratics, the scientists who are trying to understand the makeup of the universe. And you get all these pre-Socratics, and they start arguing over what's the fundamental substance. Is it water? Is it fire? Whatever it might be. Eventually you get to Anaxagoras, right? And Anaxagoras comes up with this reality that there has to be some sort of logos, right, that by which we can order our understanding of things. Now, Anaxagoras doesn't get us to quite form, right? That there's a form of things by which we can understand things. But eventually, Socrates comes along, and Socrates has this great conversion. But also in the context of having this great conversion, Socrates also comes to see that the most important thing we can know and understand is man. And once you know and understand man and the soul, you can know how to order society. And Socrates sees his big opponents as being the sophists. And the essential debate between Socrates and the sophist, I think if you understand that central debate, it gives you insight into a lot of political debates throughout time and history and circumstance. Because, and by the way, two sources for this. One source for this, a fellow named, well, first of all, the great source on this is Werner Jaeger, Paideia, Volume 3. It's like the first 120, 150 pages. That Jaeger's book outlines in a clear way and in a compelling way the fundamental divide and the contest that took place between Socrates and Socrates. In Socrates' generation, it was Socrates versus Gorgias. In the time of Plato, it was Plato versus Socrates, a guy named Socrates. And then by the time of Aristotle, Socrates opposes Aristotle, and Socrates wins the contest. Right? So in the ancient world, after the death of Aristotle, pretty much philosophy is Sophism. And to give you just one indication of that, when Augustine, first of all, almost all the fathers of the church are trained in the academies of the schools of rhetoric. They're all trained as sophists. Augustine was a master of rhetoric. He was the best rhetorician, the best rhetoric teacher in the empire. So another place where you can get a quick and dirty summary if you're a Harvard student, because you don't read more than 50 or 60 pages. So a professor named John Rao, R-A-O, he gave 3 lectures in Estonia on Socrates, basically realists versus the sophists. And in that first lecture, he kind of summarizes Werner Jaeger's writings. And John Rao has his own website, and you can go to his website and look up his Tallinn lectures in Estonia from 2009. And that's also a nice little summary of the historical, this debate between the sophists on the one hand and let's say the Platonists or the realists on the other hand. And essentially, this debate comes down to what kind of education do you need in order to serve the common good? What is the common good, by the way? So the common good is the tranquility of order. I think that's the simplest definition of the common good. It's the best definition of the common good that I've come across. And the best discussion of the common good that I've come across is Augustine in The City of God, book 19, where he fleshes out what this could mean. And then, so I think someone like Plato understood all the elements of the common good, but didn't come up with the term. Just like Augustine says the same thing about Plato, that he understood all the elements of original sin and the need for that to complete an account of human nature, of reality. But he never kind of came up with the term. Right? Yes?
Sorry to go back. So Socrates sees the most important thing to understand as man, and the sophists hold that...
We're going to get there.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, we're there. We're getting there, little by little.
Right.
Little by little. We're circling. We're like an eagle, circling.
Okay.
We're circling the question.
All right.
I'm just teasing you, yes.
What's
So,
the question?
pardon?
What's the question?
The question is, what is the nature of the debate between the sophists and the realists in the ancient world? So essentially, this is a quick and dirty version of it, but essentially, the Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle say that if we're going to understand how to organize politically the society, we need to understand that man has a soul. And if man has a soul, he needs to basically be engaged in a kind of hunt, an intellectual and a physical hunt for the virtues. If men commit themselves to hunting for the virtues and then implementing them in their lives, they will turn the society as a whole into a just society that's realizing the common good. The key to this is the pursuit of wisdom, right? That branch of knowledge which integrates all other knowledge, and which also integrates the way we live with that knowledge. The sophists essentially say that this is absurd. That if you look at the history of Greece, from the Peloponnesian War, if you look at the history of Greece from the Persian Wars to the Peloponnesian Wars, that the Greeks in the Persian Wars were united, and they were united around a common enemy. And so what brings about true unity is not the quest for the virtues. What brings about true unity is identifying a common enemy and uniting in order to defeat that common enemy. Now, but there's more to it than that. Because men, they need to be, if men are not given, so the sophists would say, if men are not given a common enemy, what happens? What happens is there's a time of prosperity, there's a time of general peace, but eventually that time of prosperity ends, and the society ends, everybody ends up killing everybody in a civil war, which is essentially, they say, what happened in the Peloponnesian War. So what you need to do is you need to basically gin up a series of steps or a kind of conditions in society that bring about the union of people around a common enemy. And there are several elements that go into this. Number one, people do need something beyond themselves. For Plato and Aristotle, it's God. I think it's God, or the divine being, and the quest for virtue that would build up a just and common a society based on the common good. For the sophists, there's no gods. The sophists are already skeptical about the possibility of the gods. So they would say, well, without the gods, you need some form of transcendence. So it's better to kind of create a form of transcendence. It's better to create in a way, it's better to create a divine economy. A sense that there are, as you lie, that there are gods. You say the gods have given us a great society. And then the sophists would say, what have the gods given us that they haven't given to anybody else? They've given us the Greek language. The Greek language is a beautiful language. What else have they given us? They've given us Greek freedom and Greek political institutions. So we need to develop a way of convincing the people that if they are going to be rulers of this world, or if they're going to be happy, that the gods have given them the divine mission of spreading the Greek language, Greek freedom, Greek divinely inspired political institutions, democracy, which it gave to Athens, all throughout the world. How will we do this? We will do this by developing a navy. A navy and an economic system which can bring Greek goods, Greek ideas, and Greek services to the farthest extent of the world as possible. So the Sophists thought that, obviously, that everything that what Plato and Aristotle and Socrates had to propose was absurd. It was foolish. It would never actually satisfy men. But that their political program would satisfy men, right? Because it would satisfy men because the vast majority of men, they can also be satisfied by the equivalent of bread and circus. So when there's times of war or not war, you can just give them a certain amount of bread and circus. When you need to rile them up to a notion of something beyond the Greek world, you can rile them up with the notion that God has created this nation to be a kind of redeemer nation for the world. So this is the essence of the debate it begins with Socrates versus Gorgias. It culminates in Isocrates versus Aristotle. And you can see Isocrates at the end of his life in his speeches praising Alexander the Great and the House of Macedon, because he thinks that they have finally kind of bought into this whole system, and they're gonna be committed to spreading this Greek concept to the rest of the world. Now, by the way, there were many empires before the Greek Empire. There was the Akkadian Empire, the Babylonian, the Persian Empire. The Greeks are not the first ones to come up with the idea of kind of establishing colonies outside of your home base society. But we just, and so far, at least to my knowledge, we have not been able to establish that there was any similar kind of debate in these empires or societies that were before the Greek world. I'm open to any research that comes along that would show that, But this seems to have been a debate that was unique to the Greek world. This kind of debate between philosophy and the Sophists. And as I said, this debate has, the Sophists won out. So the primary mode of education in the ancient world was the houses of rhetoric, the schools of rhetoric. I think you can see that just to kind of jump ahead a little bit, in the early 20th century, as far as shaping politics, let's say in the modern world, so just to kind of give a sense of how these ideas could be reinvigorated or brought back and reacted out in a modern context. So in the early 1900s, the British were thinking about how do we extend our empire, how do we keep our empire or extend it or hand it over to the Americans, or what do we do? So they enlisted this fellow named Herbert Mackinder. I think it was Herbert or Gilbert Mackinder, but certainly the last name was Mackinder. And Mackinder came up with the Mackinder thesis. And the Mackinder thesis is that if you take the ancient Peloponnesian War and you blow the Peloponnesian War up to like a macro level, you could essentially say that if Athens consisted of the island nations, if Athens had an island, like a mini island empire, Sparta had a mini land empire. And so the Peloponnesian War was this conflict between a land empire that was an oligarchy, and Athens at the time was an oligarchy with a democratic front. So it was oligarchic clubs that ruled Athens under kind of a democratic facade, which is actually the best form of democracy. right? That the oligarchs are running the things from behind the scenes, but you have a kind of democratic facade that keeps everybody happy. For the sophists, that's the best form of democracy. So Mackinder said, essentially in the world now, you have an island empire and a land empire. So the island empire, as of 19 whatever, is led by Britain, by England, right? And they included at the time. He included at the time the land, the island empire as being Britain, then potentially Canada, the United States, Australia. What would be, let's say, a future state in the Middle East, South Africa, Japan, and then British, whatever British little colonies they had over there in Asia. The potential land, so at the time, Mackinder said, Britain is like Athens. Its empire is not strictly speaking political. It's a mixture of politics and economics. So it's kind of a colonial empire. It offers protection. And in exchange for protection, you get to participate in the economy, right? If you reject the protection, you no longer get to participate in the economy. And if you also reject the protection, they might come in and protect you anyway, because the Persians were still around, right? So Mackinder says, or those who were kind of with Mackinder says, the one real threat to the British Empire is that if you have a union, a kind of a political economic union between nations that could establish an economy that could survive independently of the British economic system. And Mackinder said, well, because Mackinder was also trained in geology, so Mackinder said, well, you have that. You have a real danger if you ever had a union of German efficiency and German engineering with Russia. Because Russia has almost all the minerals in the world. Russia has deposits of almost all the minerals in the world except for two. Russia can produce, at the time, all of the food that the Germans need, because Germany for some reason doesn't have enough land mass to produce the food that it needs for its population, historically. So Mackinder reasoned the biggest danger in the world would be if you had a kind of economy that would not be reliant on the navy of the British Empire. And so what you need to do is you need to prevent any form of permanent alliance or union, economic or political, between landmass connected countries in Eurasia that could become like the equivalent of the Spartan Empire, because they could develop an economy that would be independent of the British economic system. So the goal of British foreign policy and then American foreign policy after that point in the 20th century was to essentially prevent that economic union from ever happening. So for example, the major advisors of, let's say, the presidents going back to Nixon were Brzezinski and Kissinger. Kissinger is still alive. Kissinger and Brzezinski, for the most part, took the Mackinder thesis, which was based on the Peloponnesian War, as like the guiding principle for negotiating international relations, like how to think about the world. And I was actually at a conference in 2009, sponsored by some Greeks and Russians, which took place in Rhodes. And while I was not at this speech, at this conference, there was a speech given basically proposing the One Belt, One Road initiative as the way of supplanting the Mackinder thesis in international relations. So the One Belt, One Road initiative, there were a bunch of, at this particular conference, there were a bunch of academics from the United States, but there were also a bunch of academics, and then there was also like these people that going back and forth between the political world and the academic world. So there were those kind of people also from Russia and China. And actually from all over the world. It was like a huge conference with over 300, with I think over 1,000 participants. It was a huge conference. But anyway, at that conference, there was an American scholar activist who proposed that the way to overcome the Cold War mentality, which he thought was rising up again, and the way to overcome this kind of constant desire to turn either Russia or China or someone into an enemy would be reestablish the ancient roads that connected China to Europe and to North Africa. So the five roads, but to have those roads now be information highways. When this guy proposed this, there were some people who realized if this happens, it would be the realization of everything that Mackinder said we should never let happen. So it's probably the case that part of the jostling that's going on right now in the world over any nation that could potentially connect China to Russia to Europe. By the way, when I was in Madrid, there were people that, essentially that became, so this guy gave this speech in 2009. The Chinese and the Russians adopted it as their strategy, as their policy. So China is trying to implement the One Belt, One Road, they call it the One Belt, One Road initiative, which doesn't play well in the English language, just given that most of us have read Lord of the Rings. But for them, it's I guess it sounds good. So, so part of the jostling that's going on in the world in international relations, I think, is over the fact that China and Russia have started working much more together in the last 10 years, last 15 years, than they had in the past. And that they've been trying to make these inroads also to integrate the economy from Europe to China in a way that might establish some independence from what Mackinder defined as the island economy.
The U.S.
Which would be England, the U.S., Australia, and other kind of Japan, other island nations. So, when I first took political philosophy, one of the questions that was raised is, should there be an international common good? Right? And if there is an international common good, what kind of institutions and what kind of laws would be appropriate for the international common good, for the international community? And I think that's still a question of our time, right? You see this played out in American politics where people will say stuff like, I don't want the New World Order, right? I want nothing to do with the international community, or things like that. But you can, but this is I think a question of our time, right? And I connect it to this debate between the sophists and the philosophers because there was a real policy, a foreign policy that guided the action of many nations and led to wars in the 20th century, right? Which was based on concepts that came out of the ancient world. Are there any comments on that or any questions?
Maybe I'm a little naive, but why is it so important to exclude the land nations?
So the question is, why is it so important to exclude the land nations?
What do you have to do?
Well, I think there is this in international relations. There is this dream of universalism going back to the ancient world. It gets expressed in different ways in different times, and there is this idea of what's a better way to run the world? If you think about it this way, what's a better way to run the world? If there's going to be this international community, how should the international community be structured? Should it be structured with a series of, let's say, big nations and small nations, and the big nations kind of set up institutions or ways of dealing with each other so that they can kind of just maintain order? Or is it better that there be some sort of international institution and all nations participate in it in some way, and that determines the international order? Or is it better that just one nation, which is the good nation, which God has somehow given, God by his providence has given freedom and justice and a sense of good and uprightness, so that they should essentially govern the world? And so if you're going to govern the world, you have to you have to prevent anybody else from governing the world. Right? So once you think of, well, how do we establish order in an international way? There's always the desire to maybe say, well, maybe my nation could be the one nation that orders the entire world. And that would be better than leaving it to the horse trading that would go on in some sort of international body, or the balancing of powers that would take place in, so Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was governed according to the balance of power system. There were big nations and small nations. And the big nations would, through diplomacy, they would try to mitigate conflict. So there was conflict in the 19th century, but they always tried to prevent the big nations from breaking out into great wars against each other. And that system lasted the balance of power system lasted for 100 years. But then it failed and World War I broke out. In part because that system couldn't account for the rise of Germany as the greatest economy in the world by 1903, 1904. And so Germany wanted to be included as one of the big nations. And England and France and Russia said, no, we don't want that. We don't want that to happen. Right? So there's this real question among those who think about the international order. Is it best left to balance of powers? Should we have something like the UN? Or maybe it's better that just one nation kind of govern them all. So in the 90s and in the early 2000s, it was a normal thing in military circles and in foreign policy circles in the United States. And the term they came up with was full spectrum dominance. We have to have enough bases around the world so that essentially we can control everything, right? Because that's actually a better way to do it. So I think the sophists in the ancient world, they would say, it's better that the Greeks have their empire that rules everything, because they'll have beautiful language, great institutions, the best bread and circus in the world, the Greek theater, right? It would be much better for everybody to have those institutions than to continue living in their barbarian ways, whatever that might be.
Question.
Yes.
Related to the deviancy that we mentioned before. So let's say if the deviancy is 5%, whatever that means. Right? That means the bigger nation, the deviancy in terms of quantity also grow bigger according to the percentage. So 5% of, let's say 1 billion people.
And so we're talking about in the world?
Yeah, we're talking about the world. Let's
Yeah.
say we have one nation.
Yeah, good. I like this. Yeah, good question. Right.
So does it mean that also the big nation is also more vulnerable to break apart? In the sense that because the higher deviancy, there's always kind of,
well, so
against.
Yeah, so I think what you see in what the sophists do is that the sophists are able to put the philosophers in the category of the deviant ones, right? And then for the sake of the expansion of the empire, they have to create certain populations or countries which are deviant. So, and so I think for example, the United States in the beginning of the First World War, we began to realize if we need to basically develop the science of public opinion to know who to create as deviant and who is not deviant, as a way of justifying our stepping into the war and then establishing ourselves as a big power. So part of the jostling in the world that goes on, depending on what your objective is who falls into the category of deviant, or what country, or what people. Because if you think about it, right, also, like if you can establish a category of people or values that are deviant, that gives you a right to move against them and to limit their activity, their behaviors, their thought, or their ideas.
So that means that in a sense you say that by let's say tagging a group of people as deviant, in fact it helps the great empire to actually control them in a way
Right. So,
become more stable.
yeah. So So by attacking by identifying and then so one of the ways that the Sophists saw that one of the ways you expand the empire is you have to establish an enemy. For the Sophists, the enemy was Iran, right? Because the Persian Empire during the Persian Wars, the Persian Empire was a threat to Greek freedom. So during the Peloponnesian War, the Sophists thought, or after the Peloponnesian Wars, in the time of Alexander the Great, the Sophists thought if we can create an enemy out of Persia, that gives us a right to go and conquer Persia.
So do you think that most of the political theorists nowadays actually functioning as sophists in the past? Because what they do is that they kind of create a group of people they're gonna label as whatever.
Yeah.
And then they try to attack this.
I think most political theorists these days, yes, they are sophists.
But the deviancy is a constant. It doesn't necessarily pertain to the sophists who create.
Yeah, they're not sophists. They're not sophists because
Yeah.
because deviancy is there.
Sure.
They're sophists because they miscategorize what should be in deviancy.
But what would a liberal person say? A liberal person would say, no, all ideas are. The liberal person would say, respond with pluralism. Of course, the reply to that, well, it's not really pluralism. The deviants are the ones who are against pluralism.
Right.
And then everybody else.
Right.
Interesting.
Good. So I think right now, why don't you just do a quick 5-minute write of 2 or 3 ideas you got from the class and end it with some sort of question that you might have.